I never imagined the moment my own children would look at me and see a problem instead of a mother. One sentence, spoken casually and publicly, shattered decades of sacrifice and made me realize I was no longer loved for who I was, but tolerated for what I could provide. That was the day I understood how easily devotion can be mistaken for weakness, and how quietly respect can disappear when boundaries are never drawn. What followed was not a fight, but a reckoning, one that forced me to choose between preserving peace and preserving myself. This is how everything changed. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 69 years old, and I live alone in a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania, United States. From the outside, my life looks ordinary, almost invisible. I am the kind of woman people pass on the street without a second glance. Gray hair pulled back neatly, sensible shoes, a routine built on habit rather than excitement. For most of my life, that invisibility felt natural. I believed it was the price of being a good mother. My husband died when our children were still young. It was a workplace accident, sudden and final, the kind that leaves no room for last words or unfinished conversations. One day, I was a wife planning dinners and school schedules, and the next I was a widow standing in a hospital hallway, holding my breath while my entire future rearranged itself without asking my permission. From that moment on, there was no safety net. I became the only pillar holding our family upright. I worked as a night shift nurse at a local hospital for more than 30 years. Those years blended together into a rhythm of fluorescent lights, quiet hallways, and tired smiles. I slept during the day when I could and drank too much cold coffee in my car before driving home at dawn. I chose the night shift so I could be present during the day, so I could attend school meetings, help with homework, and be there when my children walked through the door. My body aged faster than my spirit, but I told myself it was worth it. Daniel and Rachel became the center of my world. Every decision I made was filtered through one question: would this make their lives easier? I paid for their college tuition, helped with rent when they were starting out, contributed to their weddings, and later helped with down payments on their homes. I never kept records. I never asked for repayment. I did not see these things as sacrifices. To me, they were simply what a mother did when she loved her children. Somewhere along the way, I stopped having a life that belonged only to me. I did not remarry. I did not travel. I did not develop hobbies beyond reading in the quiet hours before work. Friends drifted away as our lives moved in different directions. I told myself there would be time later, when the children were settled, when things were calmer. Later always stayed just out of reach. The house I live in now was the same one where I raised my children. It is old, modest, and full of memories. The walls still seem to echo with the sound of running feet and slammed doors. Most days, the silence feels heavy, but familiar. Neighbors see me as a retired nurse living quietly on her own. They assume I live on a fixed income and simple means. I never corrected them. I never felt the need to explain myself to anyone. For years, I believed this was the natural order of things. Parents give, children grow, life moves forward. But lately, a quiet question had begun to surface in my mind, one I tried hard to ignore. When did my presence become optional? When did my support turn into something expected rather than appreciated? I did not blame my children. I blamed myself for wondering at all. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something was changing. Small moments, subtle shifts in tone, conversations that felt shorter and more distant. I told myself it was normal, that children grow into their own lives. Yet deep down, I sensed a distance forming that I did not know how to cross. At the time, I had no idea how quickly that distance would turn into something far more painful. I believed my role as a mother was secure, unquestionable. I believed love, once given, could not be withdrawn. I was wrong. If you're still watching and starting to feel that quiet tension building beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what seemed like a harmless family gathering is about to reveal something far more unsettling. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. The invitation arrived as a short message from Daniel, sent late one evening while I was folding laundry. It said there would be a family reunion at a lakeside resort in Michigan, United States, and that everyone was expected to attend. There was no warmth in the words, no mention of how long it had been since we were all together, just dates and directions. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, telling myself that I was imagining the distance. Children grow busy, I reminded myself. This was normal. I packed carefully for the trip, choosing clothes that were neat but understated. I did not want to look out of place among my own family. The drive took several hours, long stretches of highway broken by fields and small towns. By the time I arrived, the summer sun was already high, and laughter drifted across the water. From a distance, the resort looked like something from a postcard, wooden cabins nestled among tall trees, the lake calm and reflective. It should have felt welcoming. Instead, I felt like I was arriving late to something that had already moved on without me. No one was waiting when I parked. I carried my bag inside on my own and followed the sound of voices. Daniel was busy talking to relatives and a few people I did not recognize. Rachel stood nearby, animated and confident, her life clearly full and moving fast. They both acknowledged me briefly, then turned back to their conversations. No one asked if I was tired or if the drive had been difficult. I told myself not to be sensitive. I had always been good at excusing small hurts. As the afternoon went on, I noticed the pattern repeating. Conversations stopped when I approached. Smiles were polite but distracted. When plans were discussed, they were spoken about in front of me rather than with me. I began to understand that my presence was no longer necessary for things to continue smoothly. I was there because tradition required it, not because I was needed. Dinner was served outdoors as the sun began to set. Tables were arranged in clusters, and I was guided to one at the side, shared with older relatives and distant cousins. The main table was louder, surrounded by stories of work success, renovations, and future travel. I watched Daniel and Rachel from across the space, pride mixing with a quiet ache I did not yet have words for. I had built the foundation they were standing on, but I was no longer invited to stand beside them. It was during the meal that Daniel approached me with a small stack of papers. He was clearly in a hurry, glancing over his shoulder as he spoke. He told me it was a medical and legal authorization, something to make things easier later. His tone suggested it was a formality, nothing worth discussing in detail. I held the papers in my hands, scanning the headings and feeling a slow, unfamiliar unease settle in my chest. The language was precise and formal, far more serious than he had implied. I did not sign them. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back on the table, telling him I would look at them later. He nodded, already moving away, satisfied enough for the moment. I sat there long after he left, the sounds of the reunion continuing around me, feeling as though I had crossed into a version of the family where I no longer knew the rules. That night, alone in my room, I lay awake listening to the distant laughter by the lake. I realized that something fundamental had shifted. I was still a mother, but I was no longer central to my children's lives. I did not yet know what that meant or how far it would go. I only knew that the reunion had made one thing painfully clear. I was included in name only. If you're still watching and noticing how exclusion doesn't always come with shouting, but with silence and small gestures, comment number 2 below so I know you're following closely. What happens next will turn discomfort into something much more painful. Now, let's continue to chapter 3. The main dinner of this reunion took place just as the sky began to soften into evening. Long tables were set under strings of lights, and the lake reflected every movement like a quiet witness. From where I sat at the side table, I could see Daniel and Rachel at the center, surrounded by confident voices and easy laughter. I tried to focus on the food in front of me, but my attention kept drifting back to them, to the space I no longer occupied. At first, the conversation flowed around me without friction. Plates were passed, glasses refilled, stories traded across the tables. I listened more than I spoke, the way I had learned to do over the years. When someone asked how long it had been since we were all together, I answered politely. When a cousin mentioned rising costs and financial stress, I nodded, understanding too well what that pressure felt like. It was in that moment, without planning to, that I mentioned helping Daniel cover a recent credit card balance. I said it the way a mother might, casually, without emphasis, assuming it was part of our shared history. To me, it was an ordinary detail, one more example of how we had always supported each other. I did not intend to draw attention. I certainly did not expect the shift that followed. Rachel's reaction was immediate and sharp. Her voice cut across the table, firm enough to silence nearby conversations. She told me this was not the place to bring up money, that I was embarrassing them. The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I felt the blood rush to my face as heads turned, then quickly turned away. No one laughed it off. No one softened the moment. Before I could gather myself, Daniel spoke. His tone was controlled, almost rehearsed, as if he had thought about this boundary long before that night. He said that helping financially did not give me the right to comment on their lives. He spoke of independence and privacy, of lines that should not be crossed. In that instant, something inside me fractured. It was not the content of his words that hurt the most, but the certainty with which he said them, as though this conclusion had already been reached without me. The table fell into an uneasy quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Someone cleared their throat. I became acutely aware of my hands resting in my lap, trembling slightly despite my effort to stay composed. I did not cry. I did not argue. I could not have found the words even if I had tried. The humiliation settled in slowly, a cold weight pressing down on my chest. What hurt most was not being corrected, but being dismissed. In front of relatives who had watched me raise my children, I was reduced to an inconvenience, a reminder they wanted erased. I felt as though my role had been rewritten without my consent, from mother to liability. The years of night shifts, the missed holidays, the quiet endurance of loneliness seemed to shrink into something small and irrelevant. Around me, people avoided my eyes. A few looked at me with sympathy, others with discomfort, but no one intervened. Their silence confirmed what had just happened. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a public decision, one they were willing to stand by as long as I did not challenge it. I sat there until the end of the meal, barely tasting what was on my plate. My mind replayed Daniel's words again and again, each repetition stripping away another layer of denial. I had believed that my presence was a gift, that my voice mattered simply because I was their mother. That belief dissolved under the glow of string lights and polite applause. As the evening wound down and people began to drift away, I realized that something irreversible had occurred. A line had been drawn, not by anger, but by indifference. I was still part of the family by name, but no longer by choice. I left the table knowing that whatever came next, I could not return to the version of myself who accepted being quietly erased. If you're still watching and that public rejection hit harder than you expected, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here. Because what came after the humiliation wasn't anger. It was a dangerous attempt to fix things quietly. Let's move on to chapter 4. I left the dinner table quietly, carrying the weight of what had just happened as if it were something fragile I might drop if I moved too quickly. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was all right. I walked back to my room at the resort with steady steps, even though my thoughts felt scattered and unreal. It was not anger I felt then, but confusion, the kind that comes when something you believed was solid suddenly proves otherwise. Inside my room, the sounds of the reunion continued through the open window. Laughter drifted in from the lake, mingling with the music and the clinking of glasses. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands, trying to understand how the evening had slipped so far from my control. I told myself it had been a difficult moment, nothing more. Families argue. Words are said carelessly. I wanted to believe that what happened at the table did not reflect how my children truly felt. That night, I barely slept. I replayed the dinner over and over, searching for a version where I had misunderstood something, where I had imagined the dismissal in Daniel's voice, or the firmness in Rachel's eyes. By morning, I convinced myself that the only way forward was to talk to them privately, calmly, the way a mother should. I still believed the family could be held together if I was careful enough. I found Rachel first, away from the others, while she was organizing things for the day. I spoke softly, choosing my words with care. I told her I did not need to be involved in her life decisions, that I only wanted to feel respected, not corrected in front of everyone. Her response was distant. She said I was reading too much into things, that I tended to take everything personally. She spoke about boundaries and independence, as if those concepts explained everything. I listened, nodding, though each sentence widened the gap I had hoped to close. Later, I spoke with Daniel. I expected something different from him, some trace of the son who once relied on me without question. He was polite, controlled, almost formal. He said the family was changing and that I needed to accept that my role would be different now. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the hurt. He spoke as though he were delivering a necessary update, not responding to a wound he had caused. I walked away from that conversation with a hollow feeling in my chest. Still, I was not ready to give up. I told myself that adjustment took time, that perhaps I needed to learn how to step back without disappearing entirely. It was only later, by accident, that I understood how naive that hope had been. I was passing near the main building when I overheard Daniel and Rachel talking together. They did not see me. They spoke in low, practical tones about the documents Daniel had given me the night before. They mentioned the house I lived in, the convenience of having authority if decisions needed to be made quickly. There was no cruelty in their voices, only calculation. In that moment, something inside me went cold. This was not about emotional distance. This was about control. I did not confront them. I did not announce what I had heard. I simply returned to my room and packed my bag. The decision formed quietly, without drama. I would leave early. I would go home and think. I needed space to understand what was happening before I said or did something I could not take back. I drove through the night, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me as the resort faded behind. The hope I had carried with me into the reunion had thinned into caution. I was still not ready to fight, but I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer afford to assume that love alone would protect me. Whatever came next, I would need to face it with open eyes. If you're still watching and starting to realize this was never just about hurt feelings, comment number 4 below, so I know you're paying attention. The next chapter uncovers a truth that changes everything and forces a decision that can't be undone. Now, let's go to Chapter 5. When I returned to my house in Pennsylvania, United States, the silence felt different than it ever had before. It was not the familiar quiet that followed years of living alone, but something heavier, more alert. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the kitchen counter, grounding myself in what was still mine. This house had sheltered my children, held our grief, and absorbed decades of sacrifice. For the first time, I saw it not just as a home, but as a boundary that needed protection. I slept poorly that night, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because my mind had shifted into a careful, methodical state. The conversations at the resort replayed themselves with new clarity. The papers Daniel had handed me were no longer an uncomfortable detail. They were a warning. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I needed facts, not reassurance. I contacted a lawyer I had worked with years earlier on a small estate matter. The appointment was straightforward, almost clinical. I brought the documents Daniel had asked me to sign and explained the situation without embellishment. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I simply asked what those papers would allow someone else to do on my behalf. As the lawyer reviewed them, the room felt unusually still. He explained that the documents combined medical and legal authority in a way that granted broad control. Under certain circumstances, the person holding that authority could make financial decisions, including selling property, without seeking further consent. Hearing it stated so plainly made my chest tighten. I imagined my home being listed, sold, emptied, all while I was technically still alive and capable. It was then that the conversation turned to my finances, a subject I had rarely discussed with anyone. Over the years, I had invested quietly, cautiously. I had saved from every paycheck, contributed to retirement accounts, and made conservative investments recommended by professionals I trusted. I never spoke of it to my children because I did not want money to alter our relationship. By the lawyer's calculations, my assets now exceeded $1.2 million. Seeing the number written out felt surreal, not empowering. It was simply the result of time, discipline, and restraint. The lawyer looked at me carefully and asked whether my children were aware of this. I told him they were not. Saying it aloud made the reality sharper. My children believed I was financially dependent, limited, vulnerable. They believed I needed them. That belief explained more than I wanted to admit. I left the office with copies of the documents and a clear understanding of what they meant. As I drove home, memories surfaced that I had once brushed aside. The calls that came only when something was needed. The casual way my help had become assumed. The irritation when I asked questions. None of it had felt dangerous at the time. Now it formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. What hurt most was not the possibility of losing money or property. It was realizing that my children had discussed my future as if I were an obstacle to be managed. The emotional distance I had felt at the reunion was not accidental. It was practical, efficient, designed to make decisions easier. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed everything one last time. I did not cry. I did not feel angry. I felt resolved. The first boundary was simple. I would not sign anything. I would not grant authority that stripped me of agency. The second boundary followed naturally. I would no longer provide financial support without transparency or respect. I did not call Daniel or Rachel. I did not announce my decision. I understood that silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of strength. For years, I had reacted to their needs, adjusted to their expectations, softened every edge. That night marked the end of that pattern. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt a calm settle over me, unfamiliar but steady. I was no longer guessing at their intentions. I knew the truth now, and knowing it changed everything. After meeting with the lawyer, I chose silence, but not the kind born from fear. It was a deliberate pause, a space I needed to think without being pulled back into old habits. For years, my instinct had been to respond immediately, to soften situations before they hardened. This time, I resisted that urge. I wanted to understand the shape of the decision in front of me before I stepped into it. There were only two paths left. I could continue as I always had, saying nothing, offering support when it was expected, trusting that love would somehow correct what had gone wrong. That path promised familiarity, but it also required me to accept risk and diminish myself. The other path demanded clarity. It meant drawing boundaries my children might resent and accepting the discomfort that would follow. I knew which one would allow me to sleep at night. The first step was practical. I reviewed my finances and stopped every form of informal support I had been providing. No more quiet transfers, no more stepping in to smooth over shortfalls, no more unspoken safety net. This was not an act of punishment. It was a correction. I needed my actions to align with the reality I had just discovered. Continuing to provide money without respect would only confirm the very assumptions that had put me at risk. Next, I returned to the lawyer to formalize protections I had never thought necessary. We updated my records, clarified my wishes, and restricted access to my financial information. I made sure that no single person could make decisions on my behalf without clear, documented consent. The process was thorough and unemotional, and that was exactly what I needed. Each signature felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. When it came time to inform my children, I kept it simple. I did not recount the reunion. I did not accuse them of intent. I stated that I would not be signing any authorization documents and that I would no longer be providing financial assistance without open discussion. The message was brief and factual. I did not apologize for setting boundaries I should have drawn years earlier. The responses arrived quickly. There was confusion at first, then irritation. Questions followed, framed as concerns, then edged with frustration. I read them carefully and chose not to engage in debate. I had spent too many years explaining myself, justifying decisions that never should have required defense. This time, I let the boundary stand on its own. Emotionally, the aftermath surprised me. I had expected guilt to overwhelm me, to drag me back into old patterns of reassurance. Instead, I felt a cautious calm. There was sadness, of course. Accepting that my children might see this as abandonment was painful, but beneath that sadness was relief. I was no longer negotiating my worth. I began to notice how much energy I had once spent anticipating their needs, monitoring their moods, adjusting my life around the possibility of being required. With that expectation removed, my days felt quieter in a different way. Not empty, but open. I could make decisions without calculating how they might ripple outward. That does not mean the choice was easy. Some nights I questioned myself, replaying moments from the past, wondering if I had missed an opportunity to steer things differently. But each time doubt surfaced, I returned to the facts, the documents, the conversations, the pattern. I reminded myself that love without limits is not protection, it is exposure. By the end of that week, I understood that the door I had closed would not reopen easily. Setting boundaries changes relationships, sometimes permanently. I accepted that outcome. Whatever consequences followed would belong to all of us, not just me. For the first time in a long while, I felt firmly planted in my own life. I had made a choice I could stand behind, even if it meant standing alone. And as I looked ahead, I knew the effects of that choice were only beginning to surface. If you're still watching and wondering what happens when the safety net disappears, comment number 6 below to show you're still with me. Because the consequences of that choice begin to unfold, and not everyone is prepared for them. Let's move on to chapter 7. The changes did not arrive all at once. They surfaced quietly, in fragments, the way cracks appear in glass long before it shatters. Days passed after I set my boundaries, and life in my house returned to its steady rhythm. Morning light through the kitchen window, afternoon walks, evenings spent reading. From a distance, everything looked calm. But beneath that calm, consequences were unfolding. The first signs came through indirect messages. Daniel did not call outright. Instead, there were brief texts asking how I was, followed by questions that circled practical matters without naming them. I could sense the tension in his words, the careful tone of someone testing how much ground had shifted. I understood what he was discovering. Expenses he had once absorbed without thought now required attention. Plans that relied on quiet support were suddenly exposed. The safety net he had never acknowledged was gone. Rachel's situation revealed itself differently. I heard about it through a relative who mentioned stress at her workplace, a change in how she carried herself. She had always been confident, composed, certain of her footing. Now that certainty seemed strained. When family dynamics no longer projected stability, the image she relied on began to wobble. I did not feel satisfaction at this, only a sober recognition that independence once demanded had a cost. Emotionally, the hardest part was learning to observe without intervening. My instinct was to reach out, to offer reassurance, to step back into the role I had played for decades. Each time that urge surfaced, I reminded myself why I had stopped. Stepping in now would not heal anything. It would only restore an imbalance that had already caused harm. Loving my children did not require sacrificing myself again. Then came the revelation that settled everything into focus. Through a conversation I was never meant to hear about, I learned that Daniel and Rachel had once discussed placing me in an assisted living facility earlier than necessary. Not because my health demanded it, but because it would make decisions easier. Easier to manage assets, easier to act without resistance. The realization did not shock me as much as it clarified me. What I had sensed as emotional distance had been accompanied by logistical planning. That knowledge changed how I saw the past. I stopped framing events as misunderstandings or generational gaps. Patterns emerged clearly once I allowed myself to see them. I had not been pushed aside accidentally. I had been repositioned for convenience. Accepting that truth hurt, but it also freed me from doubt. The calls became more frequent after that. Concern crept into their voices, followed by frustration when I did not respond the way I once had. I remained consistent. I did not disappear, but I did not negotiate either. Boundaries only work when they are steady. I had learned that the hard way. There were moments of loneliness, undeniable and sharp. Standing alone, even by choice, carries its own weight. But this solitude was different from the quiet erasure I had lived with before. It was conscious, intentional. I was not being left behind. I was stepping forward into a space I had denied myself. As weeks passed, I felt my perspective shift. I was no longer measuring my worth by my usefulness. I began to notice small freedoms I had overlooked for years, time that belonged to me, decisions that did not require explanation, the absence of constant vigilance. I did not know how my relationship with my children would ultimately settle. That uncertainty remained. What I did know was that the illusion of unconditional dependence had ended. The safety net was gone, for them and for me. And in its absence, something sturdier had begun to take shape, a sense of self that did not bend at the first sign of pressure. The consequences of my choice were still unfolding, but I no longer feared them. I had survived far worse than discomfort. This time, I was not reacting to loss. I was building something new, one clear boundary at a time. After the turbulence of the previous weeks, a strange clarity settled in. I was no longer reacting to each message or imagining different outcomes. The noise had faded, leaving behind a quieter understanding of what could and could not be repaired. I realized then that the question was no longer whether my children had crossed a line, but whether I was willing to keep living without one. I spent several days thinking carefully about what I wanted next. Returning to the old arrangement was not an option. Too much had been revealed, not just about their intentions, but about my own limits. I understood that the family ties, when left undefined, could become liabilities rather than sources of comfort. Accepting that truth was painful, but it also freed me from the fantasy that sacrifice alone could hold everything together. I decided to request one final meeting, not to argue or seek apologies, but to close a chapter properly. I chose a neutral setting, the office of my lawyer, where emotion would not dominate the conversation. I made it clear in advance that this was not a negotiation. There would be no discussion of money, no revisiting of past grievances. I needed the boundaries to be explicit, spoken once, and then left to stand. When Daniel and Rachel arrived, the atmosphere was restrained, almost formal. I noticed how uncomfortable they seemed without the familiar structure of control or expectation. I felt sadness for that, but not guilt. I had already grieved the version of our relationship that no longer existed. What remained required honesty. I spoke calmly, without raising my voice or justifying myself. I explained that I would not be providing financial support, signing documents, or involving myself in decisions about their lives. In return, I asked for the same respect regarding mine. I emphasized that this was not punishment, but protection. I needed my independence preserved, not managed. Their reactions were predictable. Confusion surfaced first, followed by frustration they struggled to hide. Daniel looked unsettled, as though the ground beneath him had shifted again. Rachel remained guarded, her responses carefully measured. I did not counter their expressions or attempt to soften my words. I had learned that clarity does not require persuasion. As the meeting continued, something unexpected happened inside me. I realized I no longer needed their agreement. For years, I had waited for understanding, validation, reassurance that my choices were acceptable. In that room, I understood that peace does not come from being understood by others, but from understanding oneself. When the meeting ended, there was no dramatic conclusion, no reconciliation, no explosion. We simply stood, exchanged brief acknowledgments, and went our separate ways. Walking out of that office, I felt a quiet finality. The old dynamic had been officially laid to rest. Driving home, I noticed how light the air felt. The loneliness was still there, but it no longer frightened me. It was no worse than the loneliness I had endured while being taken for granted. This time, it came with dignity. By drawing that final line, I had not erased my role as a mother. I had redefined it. I was no longer a resource to be accessed or a problem to be managed. I was a woman with a life of her own, entitled to safety, respect, and peace. And for the first time in a long while, I felt prepared to build whatever came next on my own terms. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of those final boundaries, comment number 8 below to let me know you've made it this far. The story is about to reach its quiet but powerful conclusion, where everything finally settles. Let's move on to the ending. Several months passed after that final meeting, and time did what it always does when left alone. It settled. The sharp edges of those weeks softened into something steadier, more livable. I no longer woke up bracing myself for messages or rehearsing explanations. My days began to belong to me in a way they never had before. I rebuilt my life quietly, not dramatically, not as an act of rebellion, but with intention. I returned to routines I had abandoned years earlier and created new ones that fit who I was now. Morning walks became a habit, not a luxury. I joined a small community group of women close to my age, people who understood what it meant to start over without spectacle. There was comfort in conversations that did not revolve around obligation. My house felt different too. It was still the same structure, but the air inside it had changed. I rearranged rooms, let go of objects that no longer carried meaning, and kept those that reminded me of resilience rather than sacrifice. The space reflected my present instead of my past. Through others, I learned how Daniel was managing. Without the familiar safety net, his life became more constrained. Finances demanded attention. Decisions carried weight. He adjusted, slowly and unevenly, to a reality that required accountability. I did not take pleasure in his struggle, but I also did not intervene. Growth, I had learned, cannot be outsourced. Rachel's life shifted as well. The confidence she once projected was tested by circumstances she could not control. The marriage felt strained under pressures they had never faced together. I observed all of this from a distance, resisting the urge to step in and restore balance. That was no longer my role. My relationship with my children settled into something quieter and more neutral. We were not estranged, but we were no longer intertwined. Contact became occasional and factual. There were no demands, no expectations disguised as concern. I accepted this new shape of connection without resentment. It was honest, and that mattered more than comfort. When I looked back, I felt no regret for drawing the lines I had drawn. If anything, I wished I had learned sooner that boundaries are not walls meant to punish, but frames that protect what matters. I had not lost my identity as a mother. I had reclaimed my identity as a person. On quiet mornings, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and the light filtering through my window, I felt something I had not felt in decades. Safety. Not the fragile kind dependent on others' moods, but the solid kind built from self-trust. This life was not a victory over anyone. It was a return to myself. These days, my mornings begin quietly. I wake without urgency, open the curtains, and let the light settle into the room before I do. There is no tension in my chest, no anticipation of demands waiting to be answered. In this stillness, I often reflect on the path that led me here, and on the woman I was before I learned the difference between love and erasure. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant giving endlessly. I confused endurance with devotion and silence with strength. I thought that if I gave enough of myself, respect would follow naturally. What I did not understand was that love without boundaries does not teach gratitude. It teaches expectation. By always being available, I unknowingly taught my children that my needs were optional. The hardest lesson was accepting that setting limits does not make someone cruel. Boundaries are not punishments. They are declarations of self-respect. They define where care ends and control begins. When I finally drew mine, I realized how long I had gone without protecting myself, believing that sacrifice was the price of belonging. I think often of other women like me, mothers and caregivers who have spent decades placing themselves last. Women who believe it is too late to change because too much time has already been given. I wish I could tell them what I know now. Choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is survival. Love does not require you to disappear. I did not find peace because my children apologized or changed. I found it when I stopped waiting for permission to value myself. I forgave myself for staying silent so long, for not knowing sooner what I deserved. That forgiveness mattered more than any reconciliation. My understanding of family has changed as well. It is no longer defined solely by blood, but by respect, safety, and mutual care. Family is where your presence is valued, not managed. I am not alone simply because I stand on my own. As I tend to my small garden now, hands in the soil, I feel grounded in a way I never did before. Life continues. Quieter, but fuller. I did not lose my family. I found myself. And I learned at last that self-love is not selfishness. It is the foundation that makes everything else possible. In the end, this story is not about conflict or loss, but about awakening. It is about the quiet moment when a person realizes that love without limits slowly turns into self-erasure, and that dignity cannot survive where boundaries do not exist. Many people spend their lives believing that endurance is a virtue, and that giving endlessly will one day be rewarded with understanding. Yet true peace does not come from being needed at all costs. It comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to trade it for approval. Choosing yourself is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of survival. Growth often arrives late, but when it does, it carries clarity instead of regret. Life does not end when roles change. Sometimes it finally begins. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences and perspectives matter. Do not forget to follow, subscribe, and stay connected for more stories that explore resilience, self-respect, and the courage to begin again.